Okay, we're recording now. Thanks so much for being here. My name is Danielle. I'm an instructor with sport and business recreation. And I will throw it over to Peggy to do a quick little intro.
Well, thanks, Danielle. I'm Dr. Peggy Kuiper. I'm the Director of Sport and Recreation Business at UAF. Most of you just know me as Peggy. And we're super excited to have Emily and Danielle here today and appreciate them being willing to talk about sustainability in outdoor recreation. And Danielle B, because we have Danielle S and Danielle B on the call, but Danielle B will be leading us. And so I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Peggy. Well, I already did a little quick introduction, so I'm just going to go ahead and throw it over to our panelists. We're going to be talking about sustainability and outdoor recreation, which is a topic I'm super, super excited to chat with these amazing folks. So I'll throw it over to you, Emily, to do introduction. And if you could just introduce the organization you work for, what you do, where you're from, your educational background, and then we'll throw it over to Danielle.
Sure, yeah. Hi, everyone. My name is Emily Sullivan. I am the Arctic Program Manager for the Northern Alaska Environmental Center, and we work on Alaska's northern lands and waters. So many of you might know of the Northern Center. Our office is based in Fairbanks, but I am actually located in Anchorage on Dena'ina lands. I work full-time remote for the Northern Center. I'm also an outdoor photographer and freelance writer, and I'm the team captain of the Volley Ambassador team. So that's a backcountry ski company. And I'm on the board of directors at the Alaska Avalanche School. And I just mentioned those other roles because I know that Danielle was sort of interested in some of the intersection of outdoor recreation in my professional life and conservation in my professional life. So at the Northern Center, I work specifically on federal lands in Alaska's Arctic, so the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge and the National Petroleum Reserve Alaska, and advocate for protections and land management in those areas. And I came to my job by way of spending 9 summers guiding in Denali Park, summer trips, backpacking, and hiking, and became pretty interested in the conservation of federal lands through my job in Denali, and also just as I saw climate change kind of taking place over a decade in the state, which isn't that long, but was notable, it inspired me to seek out a job in conservation. So I've been working full-time in conservation for the last 3.5 years. Let's see, I grew up in Richmond, Virginia. So I came to Alaska in 2010 to work in Denali. I was seasonal here for a little while with the winters spent in Montana, and then I moved full-time to Alaska a little while later. I have a degree, it's actually a fine arts degree. So I went to school for more of my creative side, and then my lived experience is how I ended up finding my job in conservation. So yeah, I like to combine my love for the outdoors with hopefully working towards environmental protections.
Cool. Thank you so much, Emily. I can definitely relate with the fine art undergrad and going to the outdoors. But cool. Thank you so much. Danielle, could we get an intro from you?
Yes. Hi. Good afternoon, everyone. Before I do my intro, I would like to ask everybody if you can put both feet on the floor. So both of your feet on the floor, if they're crossed and sitting up tall, imagining a string is pulling you up tall. And then just bring your shoulders to your ears and then bring them back down. And then just do that 2 more times. Shoulders to ears and then back down. And then last time, shoulders to ears and then back down. All right. So good afternoon. My name is Danielle Stickman. I'm the Alaska State Deputy Director for the Wilderness Society, and I am Dena'ina and Koyukon Athabaskan. I'm usually on the lands of the Dena'ina people in Anchorage, but right now I'm on Kauai, the traditionally stewarded lands of the Kanaka Maoli, And this is actually where I went to college. I went to college on the Big Island of Hawaii for environmental science. And I graduated over a decade ago from the University of Hawaii at Hilo with a Bachelor of Science degree in environmental science. And since then, I've been working around the state of Alaska for over a decade in different nonprofits, advocating for Indigenous rights that were mainly due to salmon, because I was raised in Bristol Bay, and then my father is from the Yukon River. And so I also did internships with salmon and grew up at fish camp in Bristol Bay. And I've been in this position at the Wilderness Society for 6 months. The Wilderness Society began in 1935, and it has led the effort to permanently protect over about 109 million acres of wilderness in 44 states. And then we have been at the forefront of nearly every major public land victory. And our main mission is to unite people to protect America's wild places. So in Alaska, I work really close with Emily, both in the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge to protect it and ensure that the Gwich'in and Inupiat people's voices are heard and at the forefront of that campaign. And then I also work with her in the National Petroleum Reserve. And again, we're working to really make sure that Alaska Native communities are involved in those efforts and at the forefront. I work closely with the director of Alaska. So that includes program strategy, building new partnerships, fundraising, and at times serving as a spokesperson. And we develop and refine and implement conservation and political strategies that are grounded in sound science and pragmatic policy. And a huge part of our job as the director is also Inupiat. And we work together to elevate diverse voices to advocate for conservation in Alaska and nationally for the Wilderness Society. And so I think that is it for right now. Good afternoon.
Thank you so much for your introductions. I'll just go ahead and go right into the first question, and we'll go from there. So can you talk about what sustainability means to you in your life, like in your everyday life, but then also in your work? And why don't we go back to Emily to start?
Sure. Yeah, it's an interesting question when I think about what it means in my everyday life, because I certainly make a lot of individual choices in how I live my life to try to not be a huge contributor to emissions and climate change, which the climate crisis is kind of at the forefront of my concerns. When I think about sustainability, it's like, when we think about sustainability, it's how to use something without destroying it, right? And how are we living on this planet without destroying it, and with keeping it in a state that remains usable for the next generations. And so, for my personal life, there's a lot of choices that I make, like recreating in the backyard, recreating close to home. And when I say the backyard, I mean Alaska, staying within some like pretty large areas, but traveling in a sustainable way, or whether it's, driving a fuel efficient vehicle. But I also recognize that my individual actions only do so much, and especially when corporations are responsible for the vast majority of emissions. And so I would say that's also kind of what's led me to my line of work. And so the personal actions only go so far, but I also try to engage in education, op-eds, writing LTEs, staying engaged either on social media, whether that's, social media can feel like an echo chamber, but helping to educate on how we can hold corporations accountable and actually move forward with making meaningful change for the planet. So those are some ways in kind of my personal life. And when I tie it directly to recreation, I think a lot about leave no trace principles, which I think are huge, especially here in Alaska. One thing that's sort of interesting to me in the social media age is, especially as a photographer and someone who works in outdoor media, like how am I contributing to the effect on a landscape? And so I don't really believe in gatekeeping information. If somebody asks me where I was, I'm not going to lie and not tell them, but I'm also not really publishing GPX tracks on the internet that in areas that I know, don't need people repeat walking in the same place, causing social trails. And that was something that I kind of learned early on in Denali. If you've spent time there, you hear the NPS talking a lot about social trails and how quickly they develop. And so I think especially up here in Alaska, where we don't have a ton of trails and we have a delicate tundra that we go out on, like how do we spread out and not kind of like trample on the same area over and over again. So I think sustainability, like there's so many lenses we can look at it through. There's macro, like literally where are my feet walking? Where is my tent sitting? And then, or sorry, that's micro. And then there's macro, like how am I engaging in the economy? How am I engaging in conversation? And how am I kind of like living my life on a larger scale?
Thank you so much, Emily. That's great. Danielle, what about you? Could you talk about what sustainability means to you in your work and in your everyday life?
Yeah, I echo a lot of what Emily has said. Going to college on the Big Island, you learn a lot about sustainability, from doing beach cleanups to learning about how the Hawaiians have traditionally kind of made fish ponds and how they've kind of really been overrun by tourism, and in just such a small area, they have been able to sustain their culture so intact, and their culture is embedded in sustainability and tradition. And so when I went back to Alaska, that's what I wanted to look for, and that's what I ended up looking for. And I realized that that was already in me at fish camp. I learned sustainability at fish camp between Lake Clark and Lake Iliamna. We catch sockeye salmon, and one of the ways we do that is to reduce the boats and from emitting too much gases. We've learned to seine, because we also put the fish back that we don't keep. So, and then we use every single part. Until a few years ago, we used to get rid of the skin as well. And now my mom and I have learned to tan the skin using natural products. And so for like willow bark, and we started making jerky from some of the pieces that we used to get rid of. And so as we do each process at fish camp, I've kind of integrated that into my everyday life of how, if I don't need to go to work, I could stay home and work from home, which is a huge privilege. And being able to bike somewhere to the store is a huge privilege. And I just think of how my grandparents survived not that long ago. My grandma passed away a few years ago. She was 84, but she had so many stories where it wasn't labeled as sustainable, but it was sustainable. Like they didn't buy unnecessary food, unnecessary clothing if they didn't need it. And they lived a day-to-day life with what they had. And so that's what I've been working towards. I don't eat store-bought meat. I haven't really done that since I was 16. And the beauty of sustainability is that it looks different for everyone. It could look like not traveling that far, or it could look like changing your eating habits or how you interact with people and start these discussions. Because I am also in the recreation world. In Anchorage, I've hiked a lot, and I hope to one day do a trip to Denali Mountain, as I am Koyukon Athabaskan. And so I've learned about wilderness first aid and a lot of different ways in which the recreation world uses plastic and other things that you can't really avoid using. And so I've been kind of pushing within TWS on certain trips and certain things that we do. How can we make this more sustainable, locally made, and that way, so we're not just contributing more to it. But again, that's just how I've done it, and my views of that has expanded. I know there's so many different apps of how you can track your footstep, and how much emissions you're creating. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Oh, that's great. And that it kind of leads us into our next question about what comes to mind when you think of sustainability in outdoor recreation world? Because I think for a lot of us, we think of the word sustainability and then outdoor recreation. That could be like a lot of things. So maybe we'll go back to Emily for that one and give you a break. Thank you.
Yeah, so I was trying to think about like how people who are working within outdoor recreation can engage in the conversation surrounding like durable protections for the lands that we recreate on. So like maybe less on the like what are we using when we're on the lands. I already touched a little bit on leave no trace, which I'm sure you're all super familiar with. But then going beyond that, and you know, like 61% I think of Alaska is federal public lands. And even, I mean, we're all familiar with Alaska, but even more of it is just like lands that haven't been hugely altered by humans, right? And so how do we as outdoor recreators engage with those public lands? And so my job specifically, because I work on federal public lands, I'll focus on that just a little bit. But one thing that I've learned in my time in conservation is that land managers, decision makers, from the Department of the Interior to the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, they really want to hear from guides and outdoor recreators and people whose livelihoods rely on the lands that that these decision makers work on. And so a lot of times you'll have like a local land management office, but some of the bigger decisions are really coming from DC. And so when there are public listening sessions, public comment periods, it's really important for folks who are working in outdoor recreation to make their voices heard on the way they want to see these lands managed. And so whether or not, you know, it's particular to the Arctic Refuge, like we hear a lot in our line of work from guides who guide on the coastal plain, where there's the threat of oil and gas development. And what would that look like for tourism? What would that look like for guides? What would that look like for folks who fish in those rivers? And so engaging in those conversations and staying up to date on projects like the Ambler Road or Pebble Mine, and staying up to date on the areas that we really care about and taking some ownership of the fact that we all have a say in the way those public lands are managed. So I also I think that guiding and working in outdoor rec is a great way to get folks interested in conservation. And in that same way, like I found when I was guiding in Denali that connecting my guests to the landscape was a really great way to open conversations around how our recreation and our presence affect the landscape, but also how we live our lives affect the landscape. And I think up here in Alaska, where we see those climate change, we see the effects of climate change really tangibly, and we see them really dramatically. Sharing that firsthand experience with folks when we're out on the land with them, and also giving them tools to understand how their voice can be heard in the protection of those lands as well. And so, yeah, kind of a macro view on the role of outdoor recreationists in actually protecting those lands.
Cool. Thank you, Emily. And then Danielle, could you also talk about what comes to mind when you think of sustainability in the outdoor recreation realm?
Mindfulness, I think, comes to mind, and how. So some of my background I didn't mention. I've got 500 hours of yoga teacher training, and I've done a bunch of different mindfulness trainings to help to facilitate and be somewhat of a life coach. And I helped with a high school course a few years ago, and it was at a place where there's camps there every so often. And one of the things that the people that worked at the camps for all the different camps throughout the summer mentioned about the group that I was working with is the mindfulness. The group was so aware of how much food they were wasting. They were aware of the cooks and staff and the cleaning crew. They thanked everyone, and they included everyone. And part of the reason was because the goal was to think about everyone and be aware of our presence in that space. But we weren't allowed to speak when we were eating either for the first 15 minutes, which gives you space to think about where the food came from, where who prepared it, what's going into it. And so with that in the recreation world, I think a lot of cultures thought we didn't necessarily call it mindfulness, but that's what we were doing because we were thinking about the animals that we interacted with. We were thinking about if we take this animal, who may be losing out or who may suffer, and how will this imbalance the system, and will it come back next year? And so recreating sustainably is also thinking about what Emily said, the macro level of how many people have walked on that same path. And so if I'm veering off that path, how will that create another path? And if you've been in Anchorage, you've seen Flat Top and how many paths are everywhere. And they've been working to fix that. And so those are a few things that come to mind. Part of my background was also in I also guided in Denali, but it was a smaller level, just small hikes with some people that visited Denali in the way back. And it's amazing what people don't know and what they're interested in. And so just gauging the interest of visitors and also those that we tend to go out on the land with all the time. My mom and a family friend are starting a wellness center in the Lake Clark area as well. And they're really working to have it be sustainable in terms of reducing the impact on the land and trying not to create too many new trails in that area, because there are 2 other recreational businesses that kind of just really started. You can tell that there's been a lot of traffic in the last 10 years. And so just really trying to get that education out. I could go on and on, but I'll stop there.
No, that's great. And I think that part of just starting to have those conversations wherever they are gives us a better understanding of what sustainability actually means and what it means to us. Because I think a lot of times when we hear, and maybe this is my experience, but when I hear sustainability, I think of a million different things, and really honing in on what it means to me and to all of us in our daily lives or in our work and recreation specifically. How can we be more sustainable or be better? And that could be lots of things. So thank you, appreciate that. Okay, and I'll just go on to the next question. So the outdoor industry, I'm going to shift gears a little bit here, but the outdoor industry is a multi-billion-dollar industry, the outdoor recreation industry, and sustainability has become a bit of a buzzword in terms of we hear it, it sounds good, but what does it actually mean? So I just wanted to ask y'all if you could talk a little bit about greenwashing and what that means and how we can make sustainable choices when participating in a huge economic industry. And I'll go back to Emily.
Yeah, I appreciate the question about greenwashing, which is like, kind of, I think, I don't know what the real definition of it, but I'll tell you my kind of perception. That's pretty unofficial. But I think of it as like when a company wants to sell their product, and so they market it as sustainable. And that's really like the goal is consumerism. And so like how sustainable is that really? And so I think greenwashing and sustainability if we're talking about like brands, like within the outdoor industry, it's really nuanced. And so it can be kind of hard to tell, like, okay, if this product is being marketed as sustainable, why is that? So let's just say, for the sake of an example, like you need a parka, you're shopping for your down parka, and you're looking at like a few different brands, and you're trying to figure out which, it's a big purchase, right? Like $500-800 coat. Like, I want to buy something that I know isn't contributing to too much to the, harm of the planet. And so if these products are being marketed as sustainable, it takes like a little bit of digging, like, how is this sustainable? Is it the way the product was made didn't use a lot of water? It didn't use like large scale farming, and it didn't use certain products? Or is it that this company doesn't take all of that into effect? They actually do like fast fashion, they outsource a lot of their labor, and then they buy carbon offsets. Like, which of those is a more impactful way to be sustainable? And so I know that's not like probably everyone's favorite answer, because it involves doing homework and research, but I think at this point, like, it's very hip to be sustainable, it's very hip to be green. And so it does take a little bit of digging beyond like marketing campaigns, which is like ultimately what greenwashing is. It's a way of making it seem like a product or a practice is sustainable when it's not really. And the best examples of it I really see coming like directly from the fossil fuel industry, because you'll see companies marketing their investments in sustainability when they're like actually contributing more than really any other sector to climate change or to emissions. So that's kind of what I think about when it comes to greenwashing, just paying attention to how items are made, and doing that like kind of deep dive into production, but then also like paying attention to how that company votes with their dollars, because a lot of these brands we're talking about big brands, they do engage in advocacy for the climate. And so I'm not saying this as a go shop at Patagonia, but I do know that like Patagonia really invests a lot of time in seeking out relationships with local communities, in advocating for protections of different public lands, and actually kind of puts, I would say, puts the effort that they market out, they're actually doing behind the scenes too. I think a lot of smaller companies are doing that as well. And of course, buying local is like one of the best ways we can be sustainable. I know there are some great gear companies within Alaska, and that's a great way to shop, or little cottage companies like one that comes to mind in Anchorage is Revelate Designs, is like a local bike packing company, and a lot of their all of their gear is handmade in the US, and that's a great way to shop too. But ultimately, I think the other this might be moving a little bit outside of your question, but I'll just touch on it because my mind is going there. When we are like looking at these gear purchases, or looking at how our consumerism as outdoor, because the outdoor industry is very consumerist. So how our consumerism impacts the planet and the lands is also just using our gear as much as we can. And so I'm sure you're all familiar with repairing your gear rather than trashing it and buying something new. But that's also something to look for when you're looking, at your product reviews. Like, again, when I name a brand, I'm not trying to be an advertisement for that brand. But when I look at Belay skis, one thing I really like about them is that they're like one of the top most durable skis that you can buy for backcountry skiing. And I know I'm not going to have to like replace them every year. And so keeping an eye on how long you can use your gear, how well you can repair it, and then taking it to those local shops that do the repairs if you don't know how to do the repair yourself. Yeah, so those are some of my thoughts there.
That's awesome. Thank you. That's really great. And I just wanted to add to, I know we have a lot of folks maybe who are based not in Alaska. So just to, sorry, I'm reading one of the questions, but just to maybe y'all think about what your local economy or what your local, place looks like in terms of when Emily and Danielle are talking about Alaska or local things in Anchorage. Think about things in your area that come to mind. And then I'll throw it back over to Danielle.
Yeah, and so it's here, I'm just trying to close the chat. Greenwashing is a newer term, and I'm sure all of us can be one of those to raise their hand to who gets a new jacket or something. And Patagonia has a really good exchange program. If you've used it, then they have a trade-in program. And not advocating for Patagonia, but I have used that program, which I really liked and enjoyed. And I think when it comes to being how to make sustainable choices, my great uncle Butch, his name is Butch, and he's lived on the lake for most of his life. He's 75 years old, and he's had the same jacket for about 25 to 35 years. And he's got all these different patches on it. And one of the reasons why he hasn't gotten a new jacket is just access to internet to order a new jacket, but it's the quality as well. And so I remember in college needing a rain jacket, and I couldn't afford a more expensive one, so I got a cheaper one, and it fell apart. And if you've ever been to Hilo or heard of Hilo, it's one of the most rainiest places in the U.S., not the continental, but in the U.S. And it fell apart. So it's one of those things when it also affects. It's influenced by where we are in our life. Now I'm able to purchase a more expensive jacket that would be able to last. But I also know that there's programs to support people of color or those in the outdoors as well, and along with women. And so there are all these different opportunities and programs that I hadn't known about. So discussions like these are wonderful, and I really want to hear more from the students about what you know and what you've been learning. But what I think about making sustainable choices is thinking about years ahead of years past now. Would I still be able to use something? Would the next generation be able to use something? And that was also how my ancestors did it. My parents did it. It was more of not a question of sustainability, but of means and where we were. In some cases, being on a budget, that's being sustainable, and buying more whole foods is also being sustainable. And I think Emily touched on all the points of greenwashing and really doing the research, but also asking and starting those conversations with people as well, asking them if they know about a company, because you'd be surprised about some people who know so much more about a company than you, or maybe you know more. And so the more that you know, the better decisions that you can make. And it's just going back to when I was in college and the rain jacket fell apart. We don't know until we try, and we also don't know unless we ask other people. And I think just communicating and asking each other these questions and learning from each other is the best way. So that's all I'll share for now.
Great, thanks, Danielle. Yeah, that's awesome. Okay, I'll go to the next one. What work needs to be done to reach a more sustainable model on a community level scale. So we talked a little bit about interacting with our own communities, and Emily said it with the micro and the macro. But what do y'all feel is work as people who work in the outdoor industry, as people who want to work in the outdoor industry, like many of our students, or even in the retail side of things? What on a smaller community level do y'all feel are things that we could do? And I'll go back to Emily.
Well, this is maybe a little bit of an obvious answer, but I recently became more involved in the local government in the city I live in. I joined the board of my community council, and I joined the roads and projects committee, and I'm now actually chairing it. And so when I think on like a really community level scale, I think about like that involvement being probably one of the top ways I have any impact on what's going on in my community. And I don't feel like I have much impact, to be honest, but I'm staying in the loop and I'm staying involved, and I'm trying to help my community's voice being heard on some not great changes that are proposed for the green space right where I live, actually. And so I think paying attention to those, what's going on at a community level, can actually be kind of difficult, because it's not what you see on, depending where you get your news, like it's not what you see on some of the major outlets. It takes a little bit more nuance and a little bit more understanding of kind of what's going on behind the scenes. But yeah, becoming involved in, it depends obviously where you live, the way that's structured. In Anchorage specifically, we have community councils, which then speak to our municipal government on behalf of the community. So that's a great way to kind of make your voice heard on that level. I also, and I don't, when I think about the traditional stewards of the lands that we recreate on, like locally, I think that's another really important factor of community level. And so getting to know whose native lands you either live or recreate on, or your office is located on, and how you can kind of support local tribal orgs or nonprofits that are led by Indigenous peoples, I think is a great way to have an impact on your kind of hometown lands.
Thank you, Emily. And Danielle, what do you feel like on a community level that we could all do in terms of being sustainable or working towards sustainability?
I think being in this class and doing what you're doing right now is a step in the right direction. You're learning and you are furthering your education in this field. And we are in a time of where sustainability is literally in a contradiction with that. Well, it doesn't really align with what the situation of our world is right now. I mean, we're in a pandemic where we're constantly having to use hand sanitizer and masks and use things in a single-use way. And so I think it's a little difficult at this time to really be working towards what we see as what sustainability would look like 2 years ago. But I think it's also made us more innovative in how we can work together, especially since we're all in different places. I don't know where all of you are, but the fact that we're able to do this Zoom session in this class is wonderful, because it's reducing also the need to drive somewhere to go to a class and use more energy to go to one place, and we're able to do this class from home. But I think there's a lot of ways to do this on a sustainable level. Emily mentioned one way of getting involved with the community. With the Wilderness Society, we have an Urban to Wild program where it's really trying to connect, mostly in cities in the lower 48, connecting people to the outdoors. And we did a series of videos of how if we used public transportation to get to the outdoors, how long would it take? And really looking at the inequities that entails of if you don't have a car to go recreate, how long would it take to walk to the bus stop? And you have to wait for the right line. And so there's a series of videos and stories on the website that talks about that. And I think there used to be these meetup groups that would go to places to hike. But one of the ways to, in COVID, being COVID safe, to reduce our impact is to drive to places to recreate together. Also borrowing gear if it makes sense, what type of gear you're borrowing. And it makes an impact. I know that we're all just one person individually on the grand scheme of things, but there are 48 people on this call. And if we each do one little change in every day, it makes an impact. And if we talk to somebody and now I'm just yammering on, but those are a few of the things that I can think about.
No, that's great. Yeah, and that kind of in a way brings us to our next question and my last real question. And then hopefully we could talk to the audience, the students, and see if y'all have anything that you would like to ask. But we talked about our community, and now on a macro level, on the zoomed out lens, what is the work that needs to be done to reach a more sustainable the work that needs to be done by the industry, because we talked about the outdoor industry and the consumerism involved and just how much money goes into the outdoor industry to better our planet and take care of the spaces that we recreate in. And then I'll go back over to Emily.
I mean, the first thing that really comes to mind for me is actually kind of zooming in. So you said like to go out to the macro level for the outdoor industry, but I think the industry as a whole tends to, at least in my experience, like some of the climate focused larger organizations that operate within the outdoor industry tend to focus on like national legislation and federal lands. But I think that being able to zoom in and pay attention to what's going on within communities is actually oftentimes a little bit more meaningful and gives a better picture. This is speaking from my experience working in conservation. It gives a better picture of what's going on the ground and what kind of work is realistic and what kind of work communities want to see done on the public lands that surround the areas that they live in. And so I think there is a bit of a disconnect there. Like when we talk about the bigger brands who are operating in the outdoor industry who do engage in lobbying and advocacy, they're often focused on that big picture, and focusing on that big picture means we miss the nuance and we miss hearing individual voices, and we miss maybe the folks who have been left out of the conversation, not because they don't have a voice or opinion, but because they weren't asked. And so I think that can be true of conservation orgs. I think it can be true of brands. I think it can be true of the culture overall. And so taking the time to kind of really get to know the areas that are being impacted, get to know the people who are being impacted. And I think on that same scale, like one of the biggest shifts I'd like to see in the outdoor industry is, more diverse leadership in the industry. And so I don't mean like I'm not talking right now specifically about representation and visibility, which are both huge. So I do want to see more representation and more visibility for people with marginalized identities, but I really want to see more leadership from those people within the industry. And that means the industry needs to put those people in positions of leadership, because sustainability really is intersectional. The people who are most affected by the climate crisis are often people of color and people who are kind of living on the front lines. And so I think that more often than not, they need to be leading our decisions. And so that's not to say that people of color should be stepping up more, but to say that the outdoor industry should be looking to that leadership and really engaging with putting those people out front. And that's part of why I'm so happy to see folks like Danielle and Carlin leading over at the Wilderness Society, Alaska Native leadership, kind of driving a lot of the decision making on what's going on in these conservation spaces is a shift that I'm really happy to see.
Yeah, thanks, Emily. And Danielle, what do you think is work that needs to be done on the industry level to better our planet and take care of the spaces we recreate in?
So what I'm thinking about, just as me, Danielle, not Alaska State Deputy Director, what I'm reflecting on it in this question is, where does the word recreate stem from? And who created that word? What is the origin, and what audience was it targeted for? And does that represent the audience today? And I think that's a very systemic issue that is just beginning to have these conversations. I know it's beginning to have those conversations within TWS, the Wilderness Society, and other industry groups, including Patagonia and others, but really reflecting on that word recreation, because words have so much meaning in the work we do. And I really echo and appreciate what Emily said about not just like the diversity of people in terms of marginalized communities and people of color, but a diversity of different views. And so when I think of that word of recreation, I often don't see myself in that picture, because when I am out recreating, there are not a lot of people like me out there. There are more now, but that 10 years ago, there weren't that many, especially in this field. And so how can we really think of this industry and this work bettering our planet? Is it has to represent the population that is not often been at the forefront of making the decisions. And I see that the Wilderness Society is shifting that narrative, and there are a lot of different perspectives and views being at the forefront to make decisions in those spaces. But when in terms of making it better, being more inclusive of how it was done before. And I know it can't be exactly done sustained in the way that the original stewards of those places have been, because the population is too big. But there are pieces of those stewardship practices that can be included, that may just make small differences, like thinking of when you go hiking, sending gratitude to the earth, or gratitude to your body, or gratitude to those peoples that made it possible to go on that land and do that work, and really thinking of how we interact, not just with each other in this work that we do, but with the planet. And I know many of you have probably already heard this before, but in my culture, we've had a reciprocal relationship with the land and the animals. So we respected it in a way that it is like our family. And in terms of our family, we treat it with respect, and it treats us with respect. And so to take care of the spaces is to take care of our home. And we all have different rituals of inviting people into our home. So also discussing what that is some people ask that others, some people ask people to take their shoes off when they come into their home, others don't. And so getting to a consensus and understanding of really what is recreation, and what are we really working towards as a collective, and what would that mean to better our planet? Is it so everyone can recreate and enjoy it, or is it to there are so many options and avenues to go down? And so coming to a conversation and making change in systems, it starts small, but these conversations do impact the decision makers if we keep bringing them up, and they are starting to make change in these spaces, and I've seen it. And so
Cool. Thank you so much, Danielle, and thank you for posing that question so we could all think a little deeper about what we mean, and when we're thinking about the way that we're interacting with the spaces that we're going to. I think that's super important. So I appreciate that. Okay, well, those are all of the questions. So I wanted to see if anybody in the audience had questions that you would like to ask Danielle and Emily while we have them here. So you could either put it in the chat box, which seems to work really well, or ask your question, but we're here to field those questions. Does anybody have any questions? I can ask Tybin, I think there's a maybe there was a front. Oh, okay. So just talking about Adidas and the recycled plastic shoes in reference to, maybe you meant the greenwashing. Okay, I see. Cool. Yeah, do you have any thoughts on that, Danielle or Emily?
I don't know if I'm familiar enough with the Adidas shoes, sadly.
I think that's a great example of like maybe what we were talking about in terms of greenwashing, but also of a company wanting to do something more sustainable by making shoes out of recycled plastic instead of normal plastic.
I mean,
Okay.
oh, go ahead.
Sorry, you could go.
I was gonna say, without like an intimate knowledge of exactly how these shoes are made, it's hard for me to comment much. But I think it's definitely possible to like recycling is possible to do in a really good way. It's also possible to do in like kind of a wasteful way. So it's one of those things, like earlier I was saying, you kind of have to do your homework on these things, and I have not done mine on the Adidas shoes, so I don't know if I can provide a great comment on that.
Totally. Okay, there's a question. What do you enjoy most about your job? And I think that would be awesome to hear from both of you. Danielle, do you want to go first?
yes, I find this information. I didn't know about Adidas, so I know that the Nike program, Nike used to try to receive shoes and recycle them or reuse them. So that's a good, it's a good thing to look into, and I'd be interested in that because shoes, we go through them really quickly in the recreational world. I mean, if you're hiking, I think a good pair of hiking shoes only lasts a few years, but that would be something to look into. The what I most enjoy about my job, as I've only been on this job for about 6 months, and it's been a huge learning curve. Before this job, I was mainly working as a liaison between communities and scientists and federal and state decision makers in the both in the Arctic science world and in the fisheries science world. So this is my first job that I've learned about policy and lobbying and really work on an issue like the Arctic refuge. And I've coming from Bristol Bay, I've worked on the Pebble campaign and worked against that because it's 9 miles away from my home. But the one thing that I really have enjoyed so far is getting to know the people in this work. And usually we would be able to travel to the communities, but really getting to know the different aspects and different people within the Wilderness Society, coming to this work and really having a passion for it and learning their stories and what their goals are with this work. The one thing that I really didn't learn in college was about the social aspects of any type of work that you do, of learning how to get to know the people that you're spending 40 hours a week with, and how to create lasting change and a connection, and especially with communities. And so that's the favorite part of my day, is learning something new about the people I work with and how we all really are working towards the same goal of preserving an area, or to get more Indigenous voices at the table in an equitable way. I'm sorry, that was long.
No, that's great. Thank you. And I think that's really helpful for when y'all are going out to look for jobs or think about where you want to work or what you want to do for work. I think that the input from Danielle and Emily, and kind of the reason why we have these speaker series, is to help in students making those decisions and going out into the world and taking this advice into account. So Emily, what's your favorite part of your job?
Well, at the risk of sounding lame, some of my favorite parts are the same as Danielle. Working in conservation can be really difficult, and it can lead to burnout, I think, really easily. But working with folks that are invested in the same outcome as I am, and like we all support each other, and I've made a lot of friendships through this work. And Danielle and I obviously work at different organizations, but we work closely together, and we work with a lot of other really great people who I've formed some very real friendships with. I've also had just a great opportunity. Well, I've had one great opportunity since I've been on my job to get out on the land that I work to protect, and that was up in the Arctic Refuge. And that was a trip last summer with a project that Danielle and I both work on. It's led by the Wilderness Society, called the Imago Initiative, and it's a effort to shift conservation to look at the land through an Indigenous lens. And so a large group of us went up to the Arctic Refuge, and there were a number of Indigenous participants and a number of conservation participants. And we spent a lot of time on the Hula Hula River, camping and drinking tea and talking and learning about each other and the lands that we protect. And it's not uncommon. It's not like we do it all the time, but it's not uncommon in conservation to get to go out and spend time on the land. So that's probably the best part.
That's great. Sorry, I'm reading the chat box again. Thank you so much, Emily and Danielle. And we're getting to the end of our time, and I appreciate y'all being here, and really so much hearing your responses and your thoughts on sustainability in general is really eye-opening for me. And I hope that for our students and people watching, it can be helpful in moving forward and giving us a more clear view about what sustainability means, or what sustainability means to us, and how we can implement that in our everyday lives. And when we're in the business, sport, recreation program, thinking about the work that we want to do, being able to keep some of this stuff in mind and take it with us as we move forward. So again, Emily and Danielle, thank you so much. It's so awesome to have you. and I'm reading the chat again, but I'll just leave it at that and let everyone go. And I hope you have a great rest of your night, and thanks for coming to our speaker series.
Thank you both. And yeah, thank you to everyone attending. So
Thank
Thanks
you.
for having us.
Thank you for having us, Chinon.
Yeah, thank you.